Welcome to Strictly Facts, a guide to Caribbean history and culture, hosted by me, Dr. Alexandria Miller. Strictly Facts teaches the history, politics, and activism of the Caribbean and connects these themes to contemporary music and popular culture. Hello, everyone. Wagwan, Pamataguan. Welcome back to another episode of Strictly Facts, a guide to Caribbean history and culture, where we explore the past in order to better understand the possibilities of the future. Today's conversation is centered around imagination and possibility, specifically how Caribbean futures are being shaped through renewed connections with the African continent and its global diaspora. I am certainly not the first and certainly won't be the last to say this, but one of the greatest facets of the Caribbean is our people and subsequently the culture we've built and produced together. For generations, the Caribbean has been positioned within global systems primarily as a site of extraction, of land, of labor, of resources, while its people's creativity and intellectual power have been undervalued or commodified elsewhere. Yet across the region and the African continent and wider diaspora, creative industries continue to thrive, offering new ways of thinking about development, trade, solidarity, especially that centers people as the most valuable resources. And if you're unfamiliar with the term creative industries, or more broadly referred to as cultural and creative industries or CCIs, they are the economic sectors that combined creative products and, commercialization of creation, particularly thinking about, artistic works, whether that be music, film, fashion, etc. This is, of course, making so much tremendous sense to me in terms of the power of our CCIs. When, if you have your ear to the ground, there is always a festival going on. Carnival, of course. That actually is an episode idea that I've longed for for a long time to do. So, but we'll circle back on that. But all that to say, in this episode, we're exploring how CCIs in areas like music, like film, as I said, and others point towards more intentional, people-centered models, not just for the Caribbean, but for the betterment of African and Caribbean connection. We'll reflect on what it would take to support these futures, what structural changes are needed, and how these possibilities exist within a complex global political landscape. Ultimately, this conversation invites us to imagine what becomes possible when Caribbean and African futures are shaped by collaboration, creativity, and shared vision. I'm really grateful to be joined by Alistair Scott for this very timely discussion. Alistair is the founder of the nonprofit Diaspora Legacy Collective and has several years of experience in community development and a passion for, as you guessed it, our creative and cultural industries. So, Alistair, I'll turn it over to you. Why don't you let our listeners know a little bit more about you, where you call home, and what inspired your passion for development, Pan-Africanism, and sustainability?
Thanks, Alexandria. Thank you for having me. Um, where I call home. As a immigrant in this North American land, I am very much, very Jamaican as I was born, grew up there, came to the US for college a long time ago, and promptly ran straight back to Jamaica after college, and then spent another decade working there. So very rooted. I'm a Kingstonian. I'm a Wilmerian. I wear it proudly. Yeah, like that's who I am. I was kind of brought into this world of Pan-Africanism through a history teacher of mine at Wilmer's, also Wilmerian himself, still teaches there actually, now teaching my nephew. Love that. After, we suffered through the kind of content in the textbook, he often would make a deal with us that if we would behave just tolerably enough, he would give us some extra at the end of the class. And that he called, Black My Story as best part of every class. Right. And so I had the good fortune of getting that sort of extra knowledge and grounding up to CXC's fourth, fifth form, and then in sixth form with the rough introduction to A levels through a more spectacular F for my first assignment. I kind of reset the hype after the CXC grades. But all that to say, that opened up a world about how are we connected to the continent. Some of the things that we thought were nothing but turned out to be a huge deal. Who are some of these characters from the past? What's in a name? So many things. And so it sparked, a lifelong love for me. Where sustainability enters the picture is a bit later. So I was, as a child, even before, like, 6, 7, I watched Captain Planet. I was all about that. I wanted to save the environment, recycling us. I was that child. That tempered in high school, but definitely through my studies in college and then through work in communities in Jamaica that resurfaced and then was even more sort of cemented through my wife's work. She's an environmentalist. And so I learned a lot from her and her work, teaching it, being a practitioner in Jamaica as well. And so, like in later life, I've done a lot of my own education, listening to real professionals in the field, reading quite a bit to understand, like, especially for now, climate change, how it impacts us, what we need to do about it, and so on. So that's a bit about just how I've come to these interests.
Thank you for sharing. I wanted us to really start our conversation with talking about visions for the future, as I sort of alluded to in my intro. I think there are a lot of different avenues we could take this, and it certainly changes depending on who you ask. I think for me, there are certain things that are very important, sort of an understanding of a decolonial way of being, right? That you were sort of also alluding to, talking about, and what's in a name and all of these things. It can be in gender rights. It can be in climate change, and how the Caribbean survives, given the fact that we are some of the smallest contributors, but are so severely impacted by climate change. There's a myriad of things, but sort of given the impetus of our conversation, especially in terms of the creative and cultural industries, what is your vision for the future of, our people, especially in tandem with our connection to the African diaspora? And how have you seen these sort of, current trajectories fall short, or, maybe there are certain ones that you think are doing completely well as well?
As you said, there's so much and so many angles, right? My vision, I've forced myself in the last few years to craft intentionally positive visions of the future. Because the negative stuff is really easy. It's all around us. There's very many very excellent experts who do that work. And I read a lot of them. And so I've put effort into, well, what does the good part look like? If we can. And so for me, that is a world in which African and Caribbean creativity is exploded and is properly facilitated by private sector, by governments, because it is the bedrock of our development. So I say that to say our people are our sort of inexhaustible, most fungible resource, right? It's evergreen and it's limitless, not in terms of the number of people, but in terms of what people create, right? So technology is just what we work through. It's us. And so a future where we are properly using that to create value, and then we are, ensuring that people are valued for that is a future I want to see. So to give you a kind of quick example of how that might be grounded in reality, if we think about our sports, right? Of course, come from Jamaica, we love sprints, but the physical facilities in Jamaica that have allowed us to develop in sprinting, a lot of that came from Cuban investment. We didn't pay for that, right? But we've benefited hand over fist. We could be, and we are in small numbers, training folks from around the world about how to do that. That can be expanded tenfold, even without moving. So Jamaicans can go. Like everything else, there's athletes right now filming themselves for their own blogs. We can teach that way. You can market and brand and license it. There's so many ways, right? And it's just our sort of unique addition to the world magnified. And obviously the reverse can occur. And so there's a lot of good work out there for these kinds of visions. If we think about our music, there's many ways in which we can, have robust property protections for the intellectual property where we are keeping the value of the thing where it comes from, while allowing people to continue to create and make things. And so, like, one of the sort of best ways of that is if we just look at the current music industry, if we look at Afrobeats and how Afrobeats came about, despite, an environment that did not facilitate it very well, it happened anyway because of the force of creatives, right? And that innovation and us being able to then expand the thing. And so, where this has not shown up well, one of the things that bugged me, honestly, is a long time ago, I participated in Jamaica's Vision 2030 planning formally. I was on the Cultural and Creative Industries Committee. We spent 6 months working on that part of the plan with many of the heads of agencies in Jamaica, people who were definitely gifted. Like, nobody was paid for this. Everybody was taking time off work, half a day, every week for months. And so we did not get to do those same intellectual property protections that were outlined in that document. That whole thing was stifled, in very, kind of public ways that people are very familiar with how we kill policy. But that document, even when the work we did was heavily influenced by an older document still, which I took as the sort of founding theme of a series of substack articles I did. So that cultural superstate is from an actual ministry document from 2002 that was guiding the Ministry of Culture at the time. So there's so much more we could do, and it's not that stuff doesn't exist. It's right there. We can get it and just implement it. But while saying so, there's still lots of good examples on the ground. There's, NGOs working. There's artists doing cool things. We have pieces of the infrastructure that we can use to do a lot more.
You brought up music, and I have written a bit in my own work about CCI. The nerd in me had to pull up a few numbers, right? And so this is coming from an intergovernmental report. So it says, music exports alone reportedly generated, and these are US dollars, 80 to $100 million annually for Jamaica, accounting for, at the time, 1.7% of total goods and service exports. Furthermore, the entertainment sector as a whole generated about 71 billion Jamaican dollars between 2012 and 2016. In US dollars, for our listeners who may be unfamiliar, that's about 500 million USD. They're stemming those numbers from over 100,000 event permits, events that were happening during those 5-year span. And the fact that, these events not only are generating monies, they're obviously, of course, generating jobs subsequently, but that is a massive percentage of, our wealth, and to your point, right? This also goes then to the wealth and importance of our people and of our culture, right? And so when we talk about Caribbean futures and, really building greater connections between the Caribbean and our diasporas, what does it mean for us to really treat creatives, are these people that we're talking about, treating creatives, cultural workers, entrepreneurs, and storytellers as our most valuable resources rather than just, people that are a part of who we are, which it is what I think one of the most, again, beautiful things about us is we just create. We just do the thing and put it on TikTok, Instagram, we did it. And then it's not only that it becomes so massive and important for us culturally, but it extends out, you know, amongst various other peoples and becomes like people are like, whoa, I've had people come up to me and be like, oh, I heard this Jamaican song on TikTok. Can you translate
Right.
it for me? And all
Yeah.
of these things. So I just really want us to sort of cement this understanding in the value of our people in creating, because I think when you look at the numbers, it gets tricky and complicated, right? Because when I quote a number like, you know, we made $500 million USD between 2012 and 2016. Somebody could have looked on that and say, wait there,
Where is it? Right.
right, who did it go to? And
Hmm.
it begins a whole conversation about these structures, intellectual property rights, as you were alluding to
Exactly.
earlier, and several things. But I just want us to hone in on these challenges and perhaps how we can better reshape and redefine the importance of our people, because I think in a lot of ways it's not always seen in the
Right.
moment, right? Like if you take somebody like Miss Lou is a tremendous figure in our
Titan.
understanding today,
Right.
right? But was she given that same respect and, understanding in her time? That's a whole nother conversation. But all that to say,
Yeah. I think if we knew our past, this would be a no-brainer. We wouldn't be discussing it, right? It's because we've been cut off, because that is exactly what our people have done for millennia. Um, it makes me think about not just the role of what the French kind of mistakenly call griots, right? Or other such people who are, historians using music strategically. Jollies, who are more kind of deeper historians, but also like a conscience for societies, right, and rulers. But also, if we look at how artisans were regarded, they were very central and very important. So to put into context, I'll never forget just the look on my face, like to myself, when I learned about African metallurgy in like, a clean 700 years before Europeans got their heads around it, which was better for the environment, better quality metal than Europeans produced centuries later with so-called lower tech. All people have a long, 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 long history of centering the people who create. That was always the engine of our societies. And so if we understand that, we see those same people today. They're walking around, they're creating. What we are doing or what we have done is to keep stopping those people from creating and creating value for all of us that we can then benefit from. What we see is what it looks like at the bare minimum, right? It's just what people have created in spite of the barriers. What would have happened if we had put Bob Marley here today? I don't know how much money that man would have made. It would have been obscene, right? Um, and he's just like your most kind of common garden variety
right.
example. But to your point about just like the numbers and how this kind of can tally up, if we understand the value that people bring when they create and the fact that they are creating things that, unlike food, it lasts, after you've digested it, it keeps giving, right? And so you keep having value on top of value, which increases the value of the thing as more and more people consume it. Unlike oil and so many other things, that are sort of tangible. So just economically speaking, it's a no-brainer that you have these elements that take very little comparatively to produce something that can add value for decades conservatively. That's kind of one angle of, looking at it. It makes me think also about how this thing can expand. In watching like vloggers and, you know, artists and so on, I was fascinated a few years ago during the pandemic when we all were stuck to our screens. I was watching a Jamaican vlogger and I was watching him kind of cultivate his audience over time. And I see how he'd bring on different people and kind of give them a platform. And then over time, I saw him, you know, bring some people on. Then those people could grow. Some of them surpassed him in value, right? Didn't stop them from doing work together. And then that pattern kept repeating. To kind of bring it home today, I watch Asafa's content online, right? And I'm partly car guy, so I like the car stuff.
I'm on
Yeah,
Meet the Mitchells, girl,
there you
admittedly.
go.
So
Right. I went to school with him, so I get it. Yeah. Those people on the back end, they are meeting, they're sharing equipment, they're sharing space, right? And they used to create more things. So there's a Ghanaian vlogger I love to watch who is always featuring African continent and business opportunities and all the positive stuff. And that Jamaican vlogger I was watching years ago, remember when that young man went to Ghana, this much more popular Ghanaian YouTuber took him around. Guy stayed in his house.
yeah, I've seen that.
Yep, there you go. For a solid month, creating videos at the same time. And so these guys are monetizing off YouTube, each using the same thing. That's efficiency, right? And then now I see Asafa, you know, gets pulled into this little group of vloggers, right? Which then produces more money for everybody involved. Come to this Hurricane Melissa thing. I see this vlogger come in. He gets in Asafa's car. They go deliver some stuff down a Senti, right? You can't put up money. You can't put a value on that part. The guy was here. He was in Jamaica for about 48 hours. And that's what he did with his time, right? And that's just like a small example. So if we center our creatives, we are centering a big chunk of our economic engine. We're centering an essential piece of who we are and ensuring that we respect it and pay it forward.
I think to that point, there are a lot of people who are talking about our CCIs, right? It's not like we're
Right.
just having this conversation in a bubble. Most of us have certain ministries of culture in whatever, we call them in different forms. There are scholars talking about this, of course. I think of scholars like Keith Nurse, Susan Burke, Deborah Hinkling Gordon. I can keep going.
Yeah.
Uh, but also, as you're saying, right, creatives who may not necessarily be using this terminology in terms of CCIs, right? But they
Mm.
are steep in it, and this is the work that they're doing and trying to figure out how to make livelihoods, generate incomes, and generate, generational wealth also in that.
Mhm.
But I think as you were also sort of pointing us to, there are definitely some issues in how this has been substantiated, or maybe a lack of support might be a better way of framing that. And that's not to say things aren't evolving. I believe just last year, in Jamaica, our Ministry of Culture changed to, I believe it's like there's like a new form of health insurance specifically for creatives who are
Yeah.
registered within our CCI framework, right? Which, to me sounded like an amazing idea because you can think of if you're an
Money coming.
independent. Right, if you're an
Right.
independent entrepreneur, not having that safeguard, anything that happens to you, your family, whatever, is straight out of pocket costs, right?
Hmm.
And so to me that I just sort of wanted to gauge from you, what are some of the structural changes, be that policy, funding, IP, as we were talking about, intellectual property, educational investments, et cetera, that you really feel like we would need to make to certainly affect greater change and really allow for these creative collaborations to truly flourish, as you were talking about.
I think there's some key changes. If I start with what I think we in the Caribbean and even in African countries can do ourselves without external players, there's a mindset piece, which is the biggest. There's a big policy piece, and then there's some operational stuff. The mindset one is to switch to understanding that we are investing in ourselves. And if these things are investments, it means you're putting in today to get more tomorrow from the thing. You're not looking to extract the value to deplete it, right? You're looking to build it. And what this would mean in practice is that take intellectual property, for example, one of the big barriers for Jamaica, if in terms of like, the indicators, the GIs, and like securing different brands or colors, blah, blah, blah. It's simply that there's just too few lawyers in that, intellectual property office, right? And part of that reason is, okay, you can't afford to hire more. And to me, that's silly. Those people, if you hire more of them, we will gain so much money from hiring them that it will pay for them very quickly and create a revenue stream into the country. How do we know this? Ask Puma. Long before, the recent things with, them doing the stuff. I remember 20 odd years ago seeing Puma use our colors in big, huge billboards.
I do too.
There you go. With some grandmas in them church clothes. Cock up. Yes, right? Ask the Marley family when they carry whoever to court. It'll pay for itself easily. It's one. Like if you're investing, put the resources out front, you'll reap. Um, Two is in terms of policy, we have to create literally new policy and new modalities to do business, especially across the diaspora. I remember writing a blog about something I termed, I didn't want to call it Pan-African because I know, especially people in the Caribbean don't like that term really. So I call it, trans-African partnerships and trans-African businesses.
I would ask you to say more, but I don't want you to cut off your thought.
Oh yeah, oh, because that would get, yes. I have so many things to say on that. Um, and that's just like a bit of myopia on our part. But we need structures that enable us to connect and do business and do life together. That's your visa regimes. That is changing how we think about language. So I admire Haitians because they teach their language and it doesn't stop them from learning French. My roommate in college, Kenyan, you know, we both did A levels, but what? He did his A levels, but he spoke three, maybe four language coming into college, right? Me, I was stuck with this, in my head about speak proper English. That's all that was in my brain at the time. Huge disadvantage. So with our increasing facility, we can open up a lot just by doing that. So in the region, for example, we should all be learning some African lingua franca. It doesn't have to be Swahili at all. It can be many other things, your Hausa, Fulani, whatever. It can be a tree language since so many of us, definitely in Jamaica and in like Eastern Caribbean, so many of us do have, you know, um, hereditary from Ghana and surrounding areas. But we should all be learning Spanish. And I didn't like Spanish in school, hated it. But it's common sense. Right. And so by changing those things at the policy level, we'd open ourselves up. But in terms of the types of businesses, it means that we need to have modes of business. Like literally, when you go to the company's office to register a business, you need different types that would say, okay, you are doing this partnership with somebody in Haiti for this purpose. You're doing another kind of thing. You're doing a licensing agreement, and there's a form of business that allows it and brings down the barriers to trade because we should literally be marketing and branding Aki that is produced in Ghana, right? And ship all it come here. So we don't have to, you and I don't have to spend $17 a tin. We could be spending nine. It's that. So those modalities are the things that internally we can do if we think differently about these things.
I'm going to push back on that point because I do, if you'll entertain me a little bit.
Yeah, man.
Um, well, I sort of do want you to name what you've seen as the issues with people's understanding of or, acceptance of Pan-Africanism. Because, and I say that because I think in a lot of ways, what we're talking about builds on or potentially could build on um, older Pan-African and diasporic connections and the ways that we've been able to build together, especially as we move across, nations and extend our diaspora out, the way that we've been able to not only live and survive, but thrive and build certain communities, whether that's in England, in Toronto, it goes on and on. And that's just me from an Anglophone speaking
Hmm.
Caribbean perspective, naming those
Yeah.
places. And so, one, what do you see as that issue with the framing of Pan-Africanism? But more directly to our conversation, how do us sort of reorienting our understandings of the potential for our cultural and creative industries, create new models for us to, trade and build economic cooperation and also build on these older frameworks that we might not even, be intentionally thinking about because they're so innate to us. Not too long ago,
Right.
and this is just to give another like smaller example, not too long ago, I had a conversation talking about Padna. Like the way that
Hmm.
Padna has sent people to school, has built
Exactly.
houses, right?
Yeah.
Has, sent people to med school, etc. Like is a very important part of our culture and still is. And so if we are sort of understanding the impact of where we've come from and, turning it on its head a little bit, obviously because new technologies, etc. But what are some of the potentials that we have to create change and greater economic prosperity for us in unity together?
Yeah. Those are all exciting things to me because, as you said, there are so many things in our culture, in our history, that we can bring forward or that we can magnify so that we can all thrive. But we have first have to value self. And so we have to literally, as some people would say, like decolonize our tongues. We need to get this stuff out of our heads. And so a lot of the disinformation around, say, one of my favorite people, disinformation around Marcus Garvey, for example, get that out of the head, because then you start to see some common sense things. So if you take his most maligned idea with the ships, right, and see why Kwame Nkrumah wanted that thing in the middle of his national flag, it is clearly because if you look around for centuries up to this very day, everybody has ships making a ton of money moving things. So obviously, shipping is a good idea, right? And then if you have people being able to crowdfund a shipping company, this also is a very good idea because we all aspire to, put money in the stock market and get rich tomorrow. It's also a good idea recognizing all the different places we are and okay, you stop, and you drop off and you pick up. This is elemental trade. So the concept seems to be quite common sense. The execution, much to be desired. But we've been sort of growing up to, guffaw at those things. What was a little dark man thinking? Silly, right? And so that's the stuff killing us. Because we've been doing these things. I was listening to Trevor Noah interview Mia Motley recently, Prime Minister of Barbados, and they were talking about same partner, right? And it made me think about companies like Susu, which have built a nice, digital enterprise out of it. And so that's the point. All those things in our heritage we can bring forward and remix and make into powerful things. I think literally to come back to say Haiti, Haitians can be the gateway for the Caribbean and for West Africans, French speaking West Africans, into the US market, for example, because they straddle not just the language facility, but unlike, say, Jamaicans or unlike Trinis, they're more like Brazilians in a sense because they embody so much more, recognizable African culture in their ways of knowing and being still. So they are far better interlocutors, right? So there's opportunities there. So I think if we understood our people and understood that period when Pan-Africanism was going on, what they were trying to do, we would far more understand where the opportunities are. Because if we look at each other without the middle person, then you see that, no, there's some stuff here. Last example I'll pull on is I've come to really admire both of the women Garvey married, right? So we know Amy Jakes wrote all the books, ran the businesses, kept everybody sane. One incredible hats off to this woman, right? But the other lady, all I learned in high school was like, okay, they were married for a few months and I'm separate and she still worked in a thing.
And
No.
it mix up, and
And
that
it
is
mixed
why
up.
it was a very recent episode on Strictly
Ah, there you
because it
go.
nothing the mix up is the story and it's not the mix up that should be the important part of the story. But
No.
anyways, me vex about it, but it's alright.
Right.
Carry on.
Here's one lady who went around the world building and selling Pan-Africanism and making all the connections. She got to travel to the continent several times where he never go, right? She got to meet stars, connecting everybody and moving stuff forward in the background, right? That tells us just literally just the role women play in our societies culturally as well. You know, if you're talking about either to slap around the men and be like, come get yourself together, let's get this thing done, or that person stitching together and managing and moving and pushing, right? Using the brain power to push an idea. Um, these are all old things. And so that to me is the power of Pan-Africanism. But we have so much space between that and the misinformation that we all digest so often, that it becomes a thing.
There definitely needs to be greater orientation around our education, and whether that be, in the classroom, which of course for a lot of people would think is the most, direct change, but also education outside of the classroom too. I think there's definitely sort of a mythos and misunderstanding of a lot
Mhm.
of our history generally. But I
Yep.
think what's been most puzzling to me, and this is just off a tangent, is that the 20th century was what you know. It would be one thing maybe if we were talking about the 17 and
Hmm.
1800s and they're so long ago, but like we're talking about my grandparents' time that
Hmm.
but all that to say, in our conversation, we have given so many examples of, ways that our pop culture is definitely evidence of the impact of our cultural and creative industries. I have one that I'm going to reference, but I definitely wanted to ask you, what are some of your favorite examples of the wealth and possibilities of our CCIs as they show up in Caribbean popular culture?
As a 90s person, right? Born in the 80s, coming of age in 90s, there's still something, there's always things that would stick with me, right?
Nothing like 90s dancer.
Nothing like it. Um, I like how it's, spawned so much. It created reggaeton. One rhythm, right? They didn't even understand what the rhythm was about, and it still spawned a whole other genre of music. That for me is really powerful. Right, a really powerful example. But also, if I think about other types of, creative endeavors like food, I remember when I learned that for the UK, curry, the most popular, lunchtime dish. And I'm like, okay, it's this mashup between obviously Indians, Pakistanis coming with the curry. For a lot of it's Jamaican curry too. And so that ability, there's something there with how well we are able to literally, like, because Mr. Luther colonization reverse, right? But we literally are. We do that. We transmit ideas powerfully. And we are really good at it to the point where I forget who it was, but like some Nigerian guy. I was at some conference and he was like, grew up in England. He's like, he's so influenced by Jamaican culture and by carnival culture. And, you know, Nigerians are pretty, adamant, and strong about their thing. But still, it's like, it's overwhelming, right? So there is the extent to which Caribbean people in any space rub their culture off on the people around them while usually keeping their own is a thing. And so like that I marvel at. And there's a lot there that we can and should be doing with that. I think the other big thing I look at for, Caribbean culture writ large and just how it goes out into the world is if I think about just Jamaicans as a group, you know, I have not met anyone. And like, I've been in the US for a decade. And even for like my good friends who travel a lot more than I do, Never met somebody who never heard of Jamaica. Hasn't happened. They may not know exactly where it is, but they know about it. They know they like it, even if they don't know why they like it. But they're
It's a
fine.
good point. It's a
Yeah.
good point.
So you must be able to build on that, right, in so many ways. And it's not just about the money, but that sort of cultural capital is is too real to ignore.
I thought of a very sort of similarly in the same lines because I was there at the show. What was that December 2022 now when Burna Boy performed in
Uh
town at National Stadium. And now to Burna Boy's credit, he did not just come to Jamaica. He went to various other islands in the Caribbean.
right,
So it was a very pan-Caribbean tour, right? To bridge. I mean, I'm not trying to get into a favoritism argument, but
right.
but all that to say, right? The fact that, you know, there are these moments, especially in popular culture like that, that demonstrate, as you were saying, the impact and influence, right? For him and
Hmm.
Popcorn to do a song together that
Right.
hits charts, right, globally, and all of these things really demonstrates the power of not only who we are and our
Hmm.
abilities to build, but I remember standing in the stadium and, obviously I'm part of the show, I'm singing along, etc.
Hmm.
But to some of the points that you were making on language earlier, I know half the people there probably never spoke a lick of whatever, right? But
Hmm.
everybody very
Yeah.
quickly figure out what Igbo and Shayo and all the things
Right.
meant, right?
Hmm.
And so there is a way that, when we work together, and sort of building in this framework of Pan-Africanism, as you were saying, allows us to solidify ourselves from like a
Hmm.
psychological perspective, of course, an
Right.
economic perspective, building cooperation, but there are just so many possibilities there, and I wanted
Hmm.
to for us to give space to that.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask one more question because, I feel like we could go on and on.
Hmm.
Um, but, looking forward, what might a future of Caribbean and African development, sort of in a model sense, look like? In your view, if we were really to intentionally build around this creative labor and our shared histories and, collective well-being really as the foundation of our sustainable development.
Well, I think there are a lot of pieces in place that can pretend to be really good. By that I mean, so we are already the sixth region for the African Union, which is huge, right? And that is, you know, the whole diaspora. If we were to really use those things and especially look at each other without that middleman, then we can have a future where we are part of the fastest growing, most dynamic trading bloc, where we are um, the most diverse set of connected people because the African continent has the richest diversity in most measures, languages, stuff under the ground, the people there, blah, 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 never ends. If we were to make sure people can move, and it's a point that me and Motley was making the other day as well, if we ensure people can move, the ideas will move, the money will move, we can have a society where we are far more integrated digitally, educationally, culturally, because for all of us who live somewhere else outside of the Caribbean, we meet other people of African descent. We know it's our people, right? It's in the look in the eye, you drop a shoulder, all the things, you kiss the teeth, whatever you want to pick on, how we like with food, it's our people. We know that. And so we can build economies that understand that and sort of thrive on that connectivity. Um, to put into brass tacks, I can imagine where we have integrated education systems, right? Where a teacher in St. Vincent doing a geography lesson on say the Olduvai Gorge and the valleys around it, you know, those kids, it could be a digital classroom. or where the kids are like in a WhatsApp group with kids in Kenya and Uganda. What the name of that something there? Da 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 da. Right? Like, show me a picture. Da da da. Your parents have went there? Yes. Da 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 da. That'd be awesome. We can have a situation where we are all multilingual because our economic arrangements and social arrangements require that, which makes us stronger even outside. So there's a lot of room for that, kind of growing part of the world. That's super dynamic, where we can use the technology to have a society that is very people focused, that is a fun place to be, and that is very stimulating and creative, all very possible, and better food.
That's wonderfully said. I definitely agree. I started off with this point of Caribbean futures because I think sometimes the realities of where we are so pressing, and I'm not taking from that, but the reality is sometimes so pressing that it's hard to sort of imagine what that might look like in practice, right? Or we say sweeping things like decolonize our knowledge, right? But we don't know what that might look like. But to your point, right? It could be a WhatsApp group with kids in Kenya and kids in St. Vincent. So there are so many possibilities. Alistair, I thank you so much for joining me for this episode. I think we've been able to cover such a rich discussion of, what the future of, the Caribbean might look like, and also the future of Caribbean and African diasporic connection might look like as well. For our listeners who are tuning in, I hope you enjoyed this episode. We certainly do. If you want to follow along more with Alistair, he is a phenomenal writer, I will also say. And I will link his blog in our show notes if you want to check out more. So big up to him for that. But yes, overall, I think, our cultural and creative industries are definitely a place for us to further tap into. And so if you have thoughts, if you enjoyed this episode and want to hear more about, other possibilities for our CCIs, definitely send me a message and, we can bring further conversations about the CCIs to the fore. Till next time, everyone, as always, look more. Thanks for tuning in to Strictly Facts. Visit strictlyfactspod.com for more information on each episode, and you can find all of our social media platforms there to stay connected.